This session is being recorded and it will be available on the Lancashire Wildlife Trust YouTube channel in the next day or two, I think. Is that right? Yeah. So if you want to watch any of it back, you can see it there. And I think the other thing to say is we'll definitely finish on time. We'll finish promptly. We're booked on for about an hour, so we'll be finished by 7. And it's our great pleasure today to introduce you to Steve Garland, who's our speaker for today. He's a keen wildlife gardener with a fantastic garden that we saw some images of in the spring, and I'm hoping for some more now. Steve's also a really keen entomologist, and I think you're still chair of the trustees at Lancashire Wildlife Trust, aren't you, Steve?
For 3 days.
Oh, 3 more days, right?
Okay. Our AGM, and I hand the baton to a new chair. Yes.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, well, this is the last time we'll be introducing you as the chair of trustees. Next time you'll be the ex-chair, won't you? So, okay, brilliant. Okay, without further ado, I'll hand you over, and Steve will talk you through some wildlife gardening tips.
Right. There'll just be a little bit of hesitation while I share my screen, which usually works beautifully. Is that all looking great?
Yep, brilliant.
Excellent. That's a good start. The tech's working. Right, well, welcome everyone. When I was asked to do a follow-up session to the one we did earlier in the year with a focus on the autumn, it did give me lots of food for thought. I thought, well, what sort of special things have we got going on in the autumn that I can talk to you about? So the important thing is it's not just about wildlife, it's about wildlife and gardening. So I've combined the two, and I'm going to go through some of the sorts of subjects I talked about before, but I'm really putting an autumn slant on it and maybe thinking about what the important things are to do for wildlife through this part of the year. So when I did the first talk, I listed 5 key things to do, and these are the things I think are most important around wildlife gardening, really. Now, the first one of these I'm not going to spend as much time on today as I did before, because I would hope that if people have a temptation to use pesticides, it's probably the summertime where they feel the need to think about using those. But I hope I talked to a lot of the people who were here last time out of using them, certainly as much as is humanly possible. So what we're going to talk about really is a lot of the other things there, and maybe 1 or 2 other subjects that I didn't touch on last time. The subject I talked to as the sort of the second most important thing to do last time was to have a pond in your garden. And I did make it clear, you know, your pond, make it as big as you can, but obviously it depends on your garden, and even a small pond can be good, say, for a few frogs. So you do the best you can. Now, this is people who saw me last time realized I started off with a garden that had nothing where we live now. I live just north of Lancaster, near the coast of Morecambe Bay, so it's quite mild, quite wet, and quite a long way north. But anyway, one of the things we decided very early on, and this is within a couple of months of moving in, was we were having a pond. And if you actually look at the area here, this is what we identified for the pond. And this is a bit more work in progress. You can see the water in the bottom. The water table is quite high where we live, not high enough to not have a liner in the pond, but high enough for it to be quite annoying when you're trying to dig it out because it keeps filling up. As you can see here, I mean, we went for something quite big. You want to make it as big as possible, and you want to make it as deep as possible. But obviously it has to fit in with your needs, your garden, safety considerations, etc. But once you've dug a pond out, you then need to put in some sort of liner. And I think that the reason why I'm going through actually making a pond today is because this time of year is a really good time to do it. From now on into the winter, when you get to the middle of the winter, you can have a problem with frozen ground, which makes a lot of this sort of stuff difficult. But at this time of year, a lot of the wildlife is not so active. Plants are beginning to die back a bit. It's a really good time to dig out a pond, and it will then let it settle a lot before the spring, when the insects and the frogs, hopefully, and newts and so on start to appear. Well, anyway, unless you've got a natural clay soil that holds water, you'll need to put a liner in. And again, this is just showing you the construction, all within the first few months of starting. Great big, this is a butyl rubber liner, which is the most expensive, but it doesn't break down in ultraviolet, so the sun can shine on it all summer and it will stay bendy. It won't deteriorate. I think they're guaranteed for 20 years or something, but they are expensive. You can use cheaper materials, but the cheaper the material you use, the less time it will last. So if you're thinking of a pond that you would like to have around for a long time, then it's worth spending that little bit more on some butyl rubber. There are, if you're making a small pond, obviously an old sink or an old bowl, or even down to the size of a bucket is all you really need. It's a lot less work, obviously less digging. Once you've actually dug your pond out, you've obviously then got to fill it with water. And if you have to use tap water, then you do need to really let that stand, let all the chlorine disappear out of it before you start trying to put any plants or anything living in there. Another good reason to do a pond at this time of year is there's a very good chance it's going to fill itself. If you built one at the beginning of last week, I think it would probably be, certainly around here, it would be full by now. So the plants and things, these are all wildflowers from around Britain. A local person gave me a water lily out of their pond. That one actually is a North American plant called water hawthorn, but these are all things that you can buy little plants of, and don't worry about it not looking very full. Once they get going, no problem. And that's the pond the first summer. It's hard to believe it, that is the very first summer, and we haven't had any frogs breeding in it. The water's quite clear, not that many insects. And then last summer, this is what it had become. So this is now 9 years on. So it doesn't take very much work. Nothing much went into doing that. We haven't dug anything up. We haven't transplanted anything. We added 1 or 2 more plants. We did go to the canal and get a couple of jam jars of creepy crawlies just to get things started. But that was it. The frogs found it themselves, and therefore you've got a pond. So a lot of hard work digging, bit of expense of buying a liner, and then after that, it just starts to run itself. So that's one really good thing to do at this time of year, although you could do it later in the winter if you wanted as well, or in the early spring. But obviously you want to try and get it done before the frogs start waking up in February, because then they'll be looking for somewhere to breed. Now, food. Wintertime is a time when a lot of creatures are looking for food. There's not so much around. Now, last time I showed you, I did quite a bit about pollinators and nectar and stuff like that. And here we've got a lovely red admiral butterfly in the middle of the summer feeding on a sunflower. The biggest advice I give really is don't be too tidy. If you have a look at this, oh, my screen is jumping forward. Sorry about that. Let me go back. This is the same sunflower now, and it may look very sad, but actually it's a food store that is packed full of sunflower seeds now. And later in the winter, the birds will come down and start feeding on them. And you know, why bother going to the shops and buying packets of sunflower seed? You can grow your own, leave the flowers on, and you've got these lovely seeds that will ripen as the winter goes on. And you can let, you know, the birds will use them when they need them. So at the moment, they're not feeding on them, but when the weather gets bad, they'll start to pick away at them. And this is one of the birds that loves sunflower seeds, the coal tit. And it's not eating a sunflower seed there, I admit. not only do they eat them, but they also stash them around the garden. So you find if you'll find sunflowers coming up everywhere in the pots, in the flower beds everywhere, and it's the coal tits that like planting them. Other plants that are worth leaving, teasels, that's a classic plant, really beloved of goldfinches. And again, all of these heads are full of seeds, and there are thousands of seeds in each one, and they'll be great food. Usually in the springtime, when the food's getting short, you'll get the goldfinches coming in. And Rudbeckia coneflower, that's another flower, big bright yellow daisies that are flowering now, but leave the heads on. And I've seen goldfinches on these as well in the springtime. And Verbena bonaerensis is a big, tall purple flower that a lot of people grow in the garden. It's from South America, but it does quite well in our gardens. And again, this is photographed in January when the goldfinches are eating the seeds from that. So it's quite a leggy plant. It's quite untidy. But if you can just hold back and leave it, then you're providing some more food for the birds in the hardest part of the year. So don't be too tidy. And of course, there is the traditional bird feeder as well, which we do use. And because a lot of birds won't go onto the seeds like that. And these are tree sparrows, you'll get house sparrows, you'll get greenfinches and other things. And the good thing to do at the moment is get your bird feeders and give them a really good clean. The birds won't be really depending on them quite yet. But if they're dirty, there are certain diseases that they can transmit from bird to bird. So it makes a lot of sense. Give them a good clean out and let them dry thoroughly. And then you can put lovely fresh feeders out for the birds. So that's another really good autumn job to do, I think. And the other thing about growing stuff in your garden is have a good supply of berries. And this is one of my favorite shrubs, which is the pyracantha, the firethorn. It's not a native shrub, but it produces a lot of beautifully colourful berries. And you will find that the thrushes, particularly, and the blackbirds, around about sort of the end of the year, really. It depends on how bad the weather is. If the weather turns bad before Christmas, then they'll probably descend before then. And eventually these berries will start to disappear, which is a shame in one way because they're very pretty, but it's nice to see all the birds getting fat eating these through the winter. And they have a big advantage over things like blackberries. All the blackberries that we've got in the garden at the moment, they're very soft fruit. They'll rot away, they'll be eaten now. Whereas these pyracantha berries, and also mountain ash here, and then hawthorn is another one, where the berries will last quite a long time into the winter. So when the birds find life really hard in January, there should still be some berries left. So planting these in your garden, and again, if you haven't got any things like pyracanthas, the autumn is a great time to plant new shrubs. So that's another thing to think about. And you get a surprise as well. We have a plant in our garden. Its Latin name is Mahonia. It's Mahonia aquifolium, it's called, and it's an evergreen plant. I think it's from the Americas, and it has these beautiful sweet scented flowers on in January, February time. And for the last 2 years, we've had overwintering blackcaps. That's what this little thing here is. It's a male blackcap, and these seem to have learnt that these flowers have nectar in, and they come down and drink the nectar, and so do the blue tits. So these birds have obviously adapted because this isn't a native flower. And in fact, I don't know any native flowers that flower at that time that would have nectar in, but somehow these birds have learned. And can you imagine the luxury for a blackcap of drinking pure nectar in January? I mean, it must be wonderful. So this is why I love wildlife gardens, because you always get these surprises. And the other thing is, I'm just going to shut my door because the phone's ringing, sorry. The other thing is, now is a good time of year to be buying bulbs. And if you haven't got many in your garden, or even if you've got a patio with a few pots, remember that a lot of insects start coming out as soon as the sun appears in January, February, March. And having a few extra flowers around for them is really good. And as I said before, the important thing is don't go for double flowers, go for the single flowers. And these are 3 that are particularly good for early bees. And the top one there is the winter aconite, which is very early. Crocuses, I think everybody will know. Those are really good for early bees and hoverflies. And then single tulips are also really excellent. I mean, this is the early bumblebee, which, true to its name, often comes out in February. This is a worker photographed in the summer on a thistle, but the queens will start emerging as early as February. And so if you've got some wonderful crocuses and other flowers like that in the garden, it'll provide them with that excellent early nectar, and then they can start getting to work on their nests. Another great job for this time of year is looking at your bird boxes. If you've got some bird boxes, it's a great time. You know at this time of year there are going to be no birds nesting in there, so you can safely do what you want with them. This is one of ours which has had blue tits in for the last 8 years. It's beginning to look a bit dodgy. I'm going to take that one down, and it may well fall apart when I do so. I don't know. If it does, I'll make a new one. If it doesn't, maybe I can repair it. A lot of people like to clear out the old bird nest material as well from their bird's nests. It's not absolutely essential you do that, but most people do, and now's the time to do it. Only one little word of warning there is birds do have fleas, so don't do it inside, do it out in the garden, because if you take the bird nest material out, you might wake up some of the fleas from their pupae. And they do, although they really live on birds, they do also bite people. I can say that from first-hand experience. So anyway, it's also a great time if you're thinking of putting up a new bird box or making a new bird box, do it now. It's great. It'll let it settle in, and then the birds will start looking for their new nests not long after Christmas. And so it's no point in putting them up at the last minute and expecting them to move in. Get them out now, the birds will get familiar with them, and then hopefully you'll get some nests. And another home I talked about last time were these little bee hotels, which are very popular nowadays. And this is the one I photographed last spring, or last summer rather, and it's all empty. I made a new one as well, and I had a close look at it the other day. And if you look here, these are bamboo stems, and you can see these have got little waxy plugs in, and that inside there will be some solitary bee nests. There'll be eggs laid in little compartments all the way down, and there'll be grubs which will now have been fully fed and waiting for the warm weather next year to hatch out. And that one up there, you can see what looks like a leaf in there, and that's exactly what it is. That's a leaf cutter bee, and it's cut little circles of leaves out. It's built little compartments all the way along the tube, and in each compartment it will have laid an egg. It will have gathered some pollen and nectar and so on, provisioned its nest, and the little grub will now have fed fully. It'll be a little pupa in there, and it will be waiting to emerge next year. So not all my bee hotel has got occupied rooms, but quite a few of them have. So if you've got one of these, just have a look at it now, because you might see how many you've got filled up. And then if you're very, very lucky, and I've only ever seen it once, you might just be there on the day when the bee crawls out next year. I talked about the importance of a compost heap in your garden. It's good for recycling. It means you can make your own compost. You don't have to buy stuff in plastic bags. Not everybody has a garden that's big enough to have one, but if you do have a garden that's big enough, do make a compost heap. This time of year is a good time to turn it over. You can see ours is full of nasturtiums. There are seeds that get in the compost, and we just let them grow over the summer. But you can see the compost has kind of settled down and it needs turning. It's a great time to turn it. Again, there's not too much in the way. You're not going to find things like bumblebee nests in there at this time of year, so you're not going to upset anything. You're too early for our little friend the hedgehog to be hibernating in there as well. So it's a really great time to have a go at your compost heap. And of course, at this time of year, if you are doing any pruning and you're harvesting vegetables and things in the garden, there's probably a lot to add to it as well. Just one little note on hedgehogs. You probably all know this already, but bonfire night's coming up, and a good rule of thumb is if you're going to have a bonfire, don't build it well in advance, because there's just a chance one of these little hedgehogs might decide to go in there and hibernate by November if it gets cold. Try and build it at the last minute, because then you reduce the chance of a poor little hedgehog getting cooked. And finally, this isn't a picture of our garden, this is a woodland, but if you live somewhere with a lot of overhanging trees, you'll get a lot of dead leaves. And if you gather these up, you can put them on your compost heap. But some people like to gather them up and put them in a big black plastic bag and let them rot very slowly down, or put them in a compost heap of their own. They're very slow to rot down, but over a year or more, they will make really good leaf mold, which is one of the best things you can add to your garden soil to enrich it. So if you're lucky enough to we don't have that many trees, but if you do, then you will want to be sweeping the leaves up, but keep them and turn them into compost. It's free. Another thing to bear in mind at this time of year is that all the wildlife you see, other than the stuff that migrates south, all of it is going to spend the winter in some way. And so it's worth just thinking about how you're managing your garden and how it affects these sorts of things. You have two common butterflies here, the peacock on the left and the small tortoiseshell, and both of these hibernate as adult butterflies. So at this time of year, on sunny days, you might find the odd one, but they're already looking for places to hibernate. And here on the right is a small tortoiseshell that has actually started to hibernate in a shed nearby, not one of our sheds, a nearby shed. And you may find these in your garden shed or your garage, or even under the eaves of the house sometimes in the winter time. Just leave them alone, they're perfectly happy. If you do find one fluttering around inside your house in the middle of winter when it's cold outside, unfortunately, it's going to have a hard time, but you can try giving it a little bit of sugar, mix some sugar and water, put it on a bit of cotton wool, see if it'll feed, and then you really need to release it outside to fend for itself. That's the best thing to do. You won't be able to keep it alive indoors through the winter. But there are quite a lot of other things hibernate, but there are a lot of things that die. Here we've got a wasp, one of the social wasps, and we've got a very wet, bedraggled honeybee. That's one I found on a flower the other day. That is a worker bee. Sadly, both the worker wasp and the worker bee are going to die. That bee it's on its last legs. It's been out overnight in the rain, and bumblebee nests and wasp nests die off in the autumn. And the only ones that survive are the queens. The queens mate with the males. The males die, the workers die, and the queens hibernate and form the colonies next year. So it's important, one of the other things about not tidying up the garden is you leave an awful lot of places where things can hibernate. Ladybirds hibernate as adults. So, they need nooks and crannies. Sometimes they come into houses, but they need lots of little places where they can spend the winter out of the way of the hardest weather. And these are other ways insects pass the winter. The caterpillar at the bottom is an egger moth, an oak egger. They take 2 years to grow in the north where we are, and the first winter they spend as a caterpillar, and they just go to sleep in a frost-free spot. The top left there, this is the chrysalis of a cabbage white. You may find those under the window ledges around the outside of your house. That's how they spend the winter. This down here is an elephant hawk moth chrysalid. They burrow 6 inches down in the soil and spend the winter down there. And this here, highly magnified, is the egg of a brown hair streak. Now, we're not lucky enough to have those in our garden, although there is a site for them just up the road. And they actually overwinter as an egg. And quite a lot of insects overwinter as eggs attached to vegetation. And, bear this in mind. Again, the more you clear up your garden, the more of these things you're possibly going to be depriving of a home. So the less you can do and the more you can leave, the better. And finally, this is one of the things we had this year in terms of an interesting thing that this is a wasp nest. We had an active wasp nest living in this bush in our garden, which we left alone. It developed into quite a big nest, and then round about early August, it seemed to die off. But we're not going to get rid of it. Some people seem to think you need to burn wasp nests, but you don't. The wasps won't use it again. The queens will all form new nests next year, and you can see this one's already beginning to rot away. But inside wasp nest, you get lots of other insects. This is a wasp beetle. This is one I found dead in our garden. These actually prey, they have larvae that prey on and feed on the larvae of the wasps. And they'll hatch out from that nest next spring and look for a new wasp's nest to invade. And this is a pied hoverfly, which is a really common hoverfly that you see in the late summer. And the larvae of this live in the bottom of bumblebee nests and wasp nests and eat the droppings and bits of dirt and stuff that drop to the bottom of the nest. And so leave your wasp nest. There may be some pupae of these in there waiting to hatch next year. And not everything sleeps in the winter in the insect world. Most people think that if you're interested in moths, there's nothing to do in the cold weather. But the moth on the right is what is a moth called the November moth. And it lives mainly in woodland. It's very common. And yes, it flies in November. The one on the left is called a December moth. It also flies in November, but a bit in December sometimes. Very furry, a lot of these moths, because they need to warm their bodies up before they can fly in the winter. So they have very thick fur to insulate themselves. This is an autumnal moth. They all have very apt names. This one's actually out now. And this is a caterpillar that you may find in the winter. It's a moth called the angleshades. And here it's on a pelargonium houseplant. And you quite often find that they'll eat nearly any plant. And you sometimes find these caterpillars in the middle of winter living on pot plants. So there's still a lot of insects are active through the winter. Not everything's asleep. And this is one of the big violet ground beetles, which are active all year round. And in fact, these are very important in the garden because they're predators. They will be going around eating pest species right the way through the winter, doing a great job. And the last thing I thought I would just touch on is fungi. This is a great time of year to look for fungi. Now, gardens aren't necessarily the best place for them, but if you've got a lawn, you may have a fairy ring, little brown toadstools. If you've got birch trees in your garden, you may have this, you may have this classic fairy fungus, which is the fly agaric, and that's the one you see in all the films and cartoons. Very, very common, but you won't get it unless you've got birch trees in your garden or some other similar trees. We don't have it in our garden, sadly. But if you look really closely around at this time of year, the garden most gardens have got some fungi in. This little thing is actually growing in a pot in our garden, and it doesn't look like a fungus at first. It comes up looking like a little chocolate. It looks almost like a Malteser or something. Very tiny. You can see this is a plant label, so it's quite small. And then these little things, and it's called the bird nest fungus. And I think you can guess why. It looks like a little bird nest with eggs in. But these are little pots of spores that will split open. And this is growing on compost inside a plant pot. So it's a great time of year to explore the garden. If you're really lucky, and sadly this isn't in our garden, this is in some fields nearby, you might get these parasol mushrooms or something similar, which are extremely tasty and edible. And if you've got something like this growing in your garden, brilliant, extra food. If you are going to eat toadstools, I will say though, make sure you know what you're doing or talk to an expert before you do, because not all of them are edible. Some are quite dangerous. The red spotty ones that are started with the fly agarics, they're not deadly poisonous, but they're very unpleasant and you wouldn't want to eat one. That's why they're coloured red and white, to warn you. And finally, when I started off the last talk I said that, what is a wildlife garden? And to me, a wildlife garden isn't just a bit of waste ground. It's not just a place given over to wildlife and neglected. It does both things. It's somewhere where you can enjoy wildlife, you can encourage wildlife and support wildlife, but it's also somewhere where you can grow some food. And at this time of year is a time of year when, if you've done the job well, you should be getting a few bits of produce. So these are just a few bits and pieces from our garden. Some squashes, tomatoes. I have to admit, the tomatoes from the greenhouse, and they're getting on their last legs now. But the potatoes, the dried beans, apples and onions are all quite plentiful this year. So it's been a good year generally. And as I said before, we grow lots of these things, and I don't get too hung up about the wildlife having one or two of them. Not all our apples are perfect. And we do get the odd slugs on the potatoes, but as long as they leave plenty for us, I don't hold too many hard feelings. So anyway, thank you very much for joining me again today. I hope I've maybe given you a few interesting things to think about in the garden in connection with managing it for wildlife at this time of year. And we've now got a bit of time, I think, to answer any questions or discuss anything people would like to ask about.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks so much for your talk, Steve. I was really interested, particularly, I'm admiring the photograph of the violet ground beetle. I thought that was absolutely lovely. Thank you very much for that. But yeah, lots of hints and tips, and good advice about not clearing up and leaving homes for wildlife. I've just, if I can start off with a question for you, Steve. When you're talking about building a pond, I know there's a huge range of plants that you can buy, and I know, you know, certainly in the past there's been lots of invasive plants introduced through people buying plants for their garden ponds, which then get transferred into the wider countryside and onto nature reserves, and have caused real problems, haven't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there are most of them. I think you'd be hard pushed to find. I think the garden centres have stopped stopping them now, but there was a thing called floating water pennywort. There was a thing called parrot's feather.
Yeah.
And the other part about this, though, as well, is if you decide to go out, say, to your local canal or pond and get yourself a few plants, it's worth checking with somebody who knows about the local plants to make sure that you don't introduce something nasty. The one that we don't really get around where I live, but is very common in so many places, is called New Zealand pygmyweed, crassula, and it is something you do not want in your pond. It will choke your pond out, and nobody will sell it in garden centres, but it's very common. And if you go and if you don't notice it's there, all you need is one little tiny piece of it, and it'll choke your pond up. You get other things like duckweed, which is a native, which, I mean, our pond was completely covered in that one year, and then there's a little moth called the China mark moth, and the caterpillar lives underwater and eats duckweed. And one year it went mad and it's completely wiped out our duckweed. The moth is now eating the frog bit, which it hasn't wiped out. So the moth's still here, but the duckweed has gone, and I didn't do anything.
Yeah. No, I think it's just a cautionary note, really, for people with new ponds or thinking about making a pond, because it is the most fantastic fact to introduce to your garden, for wildlife and for yourself to look at, isn't it? But yes, there's some plants that either you can get from other people's gardens, or that are actually out there, as you say, you know, around in canals and such like, that not only choke up your pond, but you could just help spreading them further. And they're of course stopping the native species from thriving. So
there are, I have to say as well, there are a few native species which I didn't put in our pond because they're very, very strong growing. Things like the big reed mace, or most people call the bulrush. That pond we've got, it would fill it in 6 months. Yellow iris, we grow in our garden in the soil, but I don't put it in the pond. It's a bit strong growing. If you have a very big pond, of course, if you can go for something enormous, then these things don't matter. But I'd go for the slower marsh marigold is great.
Yeah.
Some of the sedges are really great. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
worth spending a bit of time thinking about it, because it's much easier to introduce something than it is to get rid of it.
Yes, yes, indeed. And I guess it's been transferred around the place on birds' feet, hasn't it? And just yeah, just mechanisms where it can move from what you think is just your pond out and about. So yeah, just be careful. So yeah, that's just wanted a quick chat about that. Okay.
Yeah, go on. No.
We've got a question here from Laura, who asks, what can people do if you don't have a garden, or I guess if you don't have a lot of space, what can we be doing for wildlife in autumn or winter?
Well, if you have no garden at all, the thing you can do for wildlife obviously is, out, maybe get involved with, I would say, the Wildlife Trust or something. There is an awful lot, there are lots of volunteer groups starting to get out there again now, and lots of work parties doing work on our reserves, I know, at the moment. There are certain jobs that happen in the autumn. But I mean, even if you've only got a couple of window boxes, I mean, the same thing applies. If you've grown some flowers and they've got seed heads on, leave the seed heads. The birds will find them, even if they're up the side of a building in a window box. When it gets cold in the winter, birds get very, very good at going. And in fact, around built-up areas and urban areas, it's a little bit warmer, and quite a lot of birds move into those areas when it gets very cold. So the idea of, a little feast of sunflower seeds up on a balcony would be really welcome.
Yeah, I think I'd say as well, if you've got anywhere that you can put a pot, plant up some bulbs. As Steve was saying, crocuses or tulips in a pot, they'll be welcomed by those early bees as much as if they were in somebody's larger garden. So I know some people just have the smallest of spaces, but if you have got anywhere, and not only are they great for wildlife, but who doesn't want to be cheered up by bulbs, flowering, and the colour of it all on those sort of early spring or February days. So yes, I'd have a go at planting bulbs at the minute.
Yeah. As someone who, until very recently, I just had a balcony space in Manchester, and I was really keen to try and make it as wildlife friendly as possible, because I was desperately wanted wildlife in my everyday life, and I just covered my balcony in potted plants, and it was quite a shady balcony as well, so some stuff really struggled, but the plants that worked just sort of went for it. And then we had all sorts of bees and butterflies and house sparrows visiting. We had bats as well to watch from the balcony, which was brilliant. And yeah, even if you don't have a lot of space, even like a little bird feeder or leaving some fresh water out kind of makes all of the difference, really, because it just helps to kind of connect your space up to the other bigger kind of gardens and parks and nature reserves. So we can all definitely play a real part in that.
Yeah, and I think another thing people can do, I don't know if you have street trees in your area, but lots of people, certainly where I am in Manchester, there are street trees that are planted in what are called tree pits that have got soil around the bottom, so they're not paved up to the tree. And that again is a great place. You can put bulbs in there, you can put other plants in there, so long as the tree itself will be well established, but you can certainly add some colour and some value for wildlife by planting around in your street tree pit. Lots of people have done it around here, and it really adds something to the street, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. I can see a question on there about testing your pond water and having a problem with dead frogs and ducks as well, by the sound of it. Luckily, I've not had any problems. There are one or two diseases of amphibians that have been spreading occasionally, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why some people say, if you've got a lot of frog spawn, don't keep moving it around to other ponds too much, because you could spread, if there are any diseases in your frogs, it just would spread it more widely. As for something that's killing ducks, though, I mean, I'd certainly talk to a vet in that case and try and find out. I mean, that could be quite serious. It's out of my league, that one, I'm afraid, in terms of that sort of thing. I mean, in terms of anything that's going, it does sound like a disease. It doesn't sound like something that's just going wrong with the pond. But it doesn't sound. I can't believe it's chemicals unless you've put something in, in which case you would know. So I can't really add anything much more to that, I'm afraid, Patricia.
I think somebody else, Jackie, has asked about, she's obviously got a lily beetle problem and actually asked, how can you kill lily beetles humanely?
Well,
if you've got anything, I don't know how you can kill beetles humanely. What do you think, Steve?
Well, no, it's difficult. I mean, I grow some lilies, and lily beetles will strip them, and I'm afraid I go around and I pick them off and crush them, and the larvae, the horrible larvae that put their own droppings on their back and cover themselves with this thick, gloopy black gunge, they're particularly disgusting, and the little orange larvae. I'm an entomologist and I don't like them, and I mean, I'm afraid with those I pull the leaves off and drop them into water to drown them. I don't know what I doubt that most people would call that humane, but they will strip your lilies completely. Interestingly, though, I tried a new type of spray this year, and it's not an insecticide. A company has started marketing a number of different sprays, and they claim to repel pests. They're not harmful to plants, they're not harmful to animals, they don't kill the pests, and you spray your lilies with this stuff. You'll find it in garden centres. I can't remember what it's called straight off the top of my head, but I tried it. I sprayed some of my lilies and left the others in a very crude experiment to see if it worked. And all I can say is I need to experiment more. It was inconclusive. The lilies I sprayed were not completely free of lily beetles. And the thing with lily beetles is they seem to home in on one or two plants and ignore others. So it's a tricky one. It wasn't very scientific, but it's possible, try these things. I can't believe that they don't do anything if the company has invested in producing them. So I'm going to try them again next year. And it would be nice to have something that maybe just repelled them. Rather like I have codling moths in our apples, and this year I bought some pheromone traps that basically attract the male moths, and then they stick to a sticky pad and it kills them. And again, I don't know whether people would see that as a humane treatment, but the idea is it reduces the number of male moths so the females don't breed as well, and it doesn't stop the moths living in your apples, but it certainly seemed to, they were getting pretty bad the year before, and this year the numbers are way down. So I think it worked. So I think I'll use that again next year. So I don't mind some of my apples having codling moths in, but if it's getting to the majority, then because they make quite a mess of the fruit, I do take it personally, because I do want to eat some of my apples every year. So that's I won't spray them with chemicals. So that is a safe way of doing it, where my apples are still good to eat.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I was particularly interested in the butterflies that overwinter here, because of course they do, but they just look so fragile. I just think, how? It's amazing. And I was reading quite recently that leaf litter can be quite an important place for butterflies. Is that right? And if so, what should we be doing with leaf litter? Should we be leaving it alone entirely, or shall I create some piles with it to make it warmer?
Well, butterflies don't really hibernate in leaf litter. I mean, probably I should have put a photograph in of one of the most important plants, I think, in the garden for hibernating butterflies. That's ivy.
Right.
Where you can pick ivy on walls, it provides a lot of shelter. And it's not just the butterflies. A lot of hoverflies and so on that overwinter will go in there as well, and beetles and all sorts of things. It's really dense. The other great thing about ivy, and I'm annoyed at I didn't put a photo of it in now, is it flowers at this time of year. And the downside of it, it has a rather sort of like a wet dog unpleasant smell to the flowers, but at this time of year it is one of the best natural wild nectar sources you can have. So if you've got flowering ivy in your garden on a sunny day at this time of year, it'll be buzzing with insects, and most of the insects you'll see on it at this time of year, most of the hoverflies, are ones that will hibernate. So they will get this fantastic feed on the nectar of the ivy flowers, and then they've got winter home right next to it. What could be better? And later in the winter and the early spring, the ivy will form berries, which form great food for birds. So I should have put some pictures of ivy in. I forgot that one. Again, you've got the space in your garden, a great plant to grow, and let it flower. Let it get big and flower.
Yeah, people get very worried about ivy, you know, going into walls and fences, don't they? And even going up trees, people get worried that it'll, you know, it'll damage the tree in some way, don't they?
Yes, and you can trim it. I mean, it grows. We've got it growing on one of our. We've not got it growing on the house. We've got it growing on one of our walls and fences, and we can control it there. Yeah. But we let it go as far as we can, and yeah, very important plant for things overwintering, especially butterflies. Yeah. Yes.
Well, it's a green wall in itself, isn't it?
There is also one butterfly called the holly blue that needs it to live on as well. It lays its eggs on the flowers of the ivy, and the caterpillar eats the flowers. And then its second brood, it lays on the flowers of holly, and the caterpillars feed on the holly. So it's almost like a Christmas butterfly.
Yes.
The holly
yeah, suitably Christmassy. Yeah. Yeah. Don't say the Christmas word. It's barely October.
Sorry, we're a long way off that yet.
Yeah. So Rebecca's got a question about slugs. She has loads of slugs in her small garden. Have you got any tips for bringing a bit more balance back? She says she's trying to encourage more beetles.
Well, yes, slugs are the bane of most gardeners' lives, because they do, some of the species do eat your plants, particularly very young plants. I mean, since our garden has matured, the change we've had is the tiny white slugs that we used to get a lot of they've become rare. And I think that's the frogs, because the frogs eat those. The ones that haven't become rare are the big snails and the really big slugs, which do definitely eat some of my plants. And hedgehogs will eat some of those if you're lucky enough to have, but the hedgehogs aren't really in our garden often enough, I'm afraid, to make a huge impact on our slugs. And the other thing is, song thrushes would have eaten lots of the snails, but in our garden we don't get song thrushes. They're so rare around here now. And I don't think it's proven, but it's suspected that the old metaldehyde slug pellets were a factor in that, which are now banned, thankfully. The old poisonous slug pellets are banned, so hopefully that will start to disappear. But again, if you want to, if you grow vegetables and like potatoes, and you have the underground slugs that do a lot of damage, some people will recommend digging your garden over in the winter, which lets the birds get in there and eat quite a lot of them. But you can also, if you're happy to spend some money, you can buy nematodes you can order them in the spring, and then they come in early summer. You mix them in water and you water them on, and these things attack the slugs under the ground. And we use them this year on our potato crop area, and so far the second early potatoes have been almost slug free. I haven't dug my main crop up yet, so I don't know. We'll see. So those are sort of pesticide free ways of reducing slug numbers. I noticed Patricia's also mentioning Dave Goulson's petition to ban sale of garden pesticides, as in France, which, yes, I draw people's attention to that. like I say, we grow lots of stuff, and I've managed to wean myself right off pesticides altogether. You can do without them. I used to use them in the past, I hate to say, before I understood more, but not now. And as I said last time, there are two good reasons. One is for the benefit of wildlife, and the other is, one of the reasons I like to grow my own food is because I know for certain it is 100% pesticide free. And to be quite frank, that isn't of anything non-organic. It will have pesticide residues within legal levels, but it will be there. And there's an organisation called the Pesticide Action Network. I think they're based in Manchester, and they publish an analysis. Well, in fact, the government does an analysis of food in supermarkets every year. And I think this year, the analysis of loads of common fruit and vegetables in supermarkets, I think they had 120 different pesticides present. Only one or two samples were they above legal limits. But personally, I'd rather have my food, I don't care about the legal limits, I'd rather have them free of pesticides. And that is almost impossible with a lot of fruit and vegetables now. So unless you grow them yourself or buy from growers who don't use things like a lot of organic growers. So yes, do support Dave Goulson's thing. I know Dave Goulson. He's written a lot of very good books about pollinators and bees. And yeah, there's a lot of campaigning going on at the moment to do this. I mean, there are still arguments to use some pesticides in agriculture, but the big thing we're trying to do there is, instead of farmers maybe spraying 10 or 12 different chemicals on the crop in a year, only use chemicals when it's absolutely essential, rather than, as has happened in the past, almost using them routinely, in which case you're just killing everything every year. And there are there's an approach now called integrated pest management, which a lot of farmers are following, which is they're not doing without the pesticides altogether, but they're using other things like encouraging hedgerows and encouraging predator insects like beetles, so that the need for using pesticides is massively reduced. And one big advantage is that, I mean, pesticides are getting more and more expensive every year, and it's quite an issue if you're a farmer, because if you use a lot of them, you have to spend a lot of food. You have to spend a lot of money to get your food. So there's an incentive there now.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, you started off, didn't you, by saying it was the most important thing that any of us gardeners could do. And I guess, we all know, don't we, the catastrophic decline of the insect population. So it just seems that if we like our gardens and enjoy our gardens enough to be out there in them, tending to them, surely we want to share those spaces with the wildlife around us, and not be trying to kill half of them. It seems really odd, doesn't it? But I know people get into the habits, don't they? I think we're all in the habit of doing those things. I
mean, if you're a farmer and your whole livelihood depends on the crop you grow, you've kind of got some issues there. You've got to get a crop out. So you can although we want to see massive reductions in pesticide use because it is affecting insects. But in a garden, how many gardeners are completely reliant on the food they produce? The only people who seem very obsessed still, I talked to a local gardening group here just a few weeks ago about wildlife gardening, and I talked about all this. Now, I was totally pleased by the fact that when I went through all the various insects, saying friend or foe, and asking people what they did, there were hardly any people in the audience who were pro-pesticides now. It's really changed. And they weren't all young people with new ideas. A lot of them were very old gardeners who would have been spraying this stuff a few years ago. And I was bracing myself for a really good argument, and I didn't have one, because I think the message is starting to get through. And I don't mind a few holes in the leaves of my flowers. In fact, being an entomologist, when I see something being eaten, I look at it and I think, ooh, especially if it's an unusual plant. I think, oh, I wonder what is eating that. You know, and then I keep watching it to find out what it is. And, you know, I sometimes collect the larvae and put them in a pot and rear them up to find out what hatches out. I know I'm a bit weird, but it's fascinating. And it just, to me, that just adds more interest to the garden, really. You know, how many insects can you find in the garden? There's a guy I know who's a real top entomologist, lives somewhere in the southeast of England. And he's got quite a big garden and he lives in the country. And I think he's recorded 20% of the species of insects in the whole of the British Isles in his garden over many years. And that is, I mean, there are 36,000 species of insects in Britain. So what's 20% of that? It's a hell of a lot of insect species just in his one garden. It is a big garden, but even so, that is incredible. Just shows you how important a garden can be for wildlife.
Yeah, absolutely. And we said that we would finish on time. I'm determined that we stick to that, even though I do see that there are still a lot of questions in the chat. But what I would encourage you to do, because clearly you are interested in finding out more about wildlife living in your garden and how to help it, definitely just drop us an email and we'll do our best to answer any of your questions. So the best email for that is mywildcity@lanxwt.org.uk. I can drop that into the chat now very quickly, so it's there. But as we said at the start, .uk, right. As I said at the start, it is My Wild Garden week, all of this week. So we're talking all about autumn wildlife gardening and what you can be doing to help wildlife as we enter the kind of colder months. And our next thing is that tomorrow at 10 AM, we will be joining Russell live from the field. So he's going to be coming to us live from a park in Manchester, talking all about hibernation. So that is going to be really, really exciting. Hilary is gone. she's off. She's out of here. It's 7 PM and she's off. So I think that I will just say thank you so much for doing this again, Steve. It's another fascinating talk. It's always really great to have you join us. And thank you to everyone who came along today. Really appreciate it.
Okay, yeah, thanks everyone. I hope you learned something. I hope it was useful.
Yeah, definitely, it definitely was. I found it really interesting. So yeah, thank you so much and have a good evening, everyone. Bye, Steve.
Bye, see you.
Bye.